There's a section in this book that describes a process of taking a small object, such as a pen, and placing it in front of your eyes and focusing on it solely for a rough amount of time, not too long, and then concentrating on the room, and then repeat the process back and forth around a dozen times or so. And the purpose of this is to try and focus your perception on more than one thing at a time. So in a way, you're essentially aspiring to a higher level of consciousness, is what I would call it. It's kind of, it's similar to the Nietzschean idea of the Übermensch. And I believe that's what Colin Wilson, in his book The Outsider, which was first published in 1956, is trying to encourage, essentially. I think that's the message it wants to put across right at the end. And it's an interesting one. But before I get to all that stuff, hello, I am GC McKay, and today we're taking a look at this, The Outsider by Colin Wilson. This was recommended by one of you out there. I want to thank you very much for bringing it to my attention, because it's a fucking great book. I'm actually tempted to say it is almost like The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, but from a kind of, for me, an unconvincing, optimistic viewpoint. Now, I've kind of realised that thinking about this review, quite a lot of my comments will seem too negative, but that is because of my own bias, and my own pessimistic leanings, essentially. And as an atheist, I find it difficult to accept some of the conclusions that Colin Wilson comes to towards the end of the book. But the middle of it is fucking brilliant. That's the door. That'll stop in a minute. Yeah, in case you're wondering what I'm drinking, it's called spirulina, and I mix it with apple cider vinegar. It's disgusting, but I have a headache, and I feel like shit. It's my own fault. It was a self-inflicted condition of last night. So last night's copious drinking of a bottle of wine and 4 beers, which was pretty dumb. And I was going to record this about an hour ago, and then I just got a fucking headache. So I tried to meditate it away. That didn't work. And now I'm drinking this horrible shit. So hopefully I'll feel better by the end of this review. So yeah, what was I looking at? The sections. I mean, considering this was published in 56, it's fucking impressive. It's aged really well. And I don't know whether that's indicative of the state of literature nowadays, and the fact that this kind of outsider character has been kind of shifted to the sidelines, a little bit like transgressive fiction in general, or I'm just not aware of the books that are out there. And I think overall for me, what it's really done is helped me realise what I'm trying to do with my own fiction quite a lot of the time, which makes my gratitude for reading it worth every fucking penny, and it's something that I'm definitely going to be going back to quite a lot, because it's just got passages where, due to the dense nature of the subject matter, you kind of need to reread it in a way. I was a little bit reluctant of even reviewing it straight away, because I realised at the beginning, which I found a little bit tricky to get into, was kind of highlighted as I got to the middle, where it really kind of takes off. And it makes me want to go back to that in order to kind of reinterpret how I kind of saw it. Because at the beginning, I kind of felt like he was just referencing a lot of these outsider types, from Albert Camus' Meursault to Sartre's Requinton, I think is the name. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. To Hesse's Steppenwolf. Loads of these types. He even mentions Van Gogh as an outsider, but I'll get onto that in a bit anyway. So I believe it's in the fourth section. The Attempt to Gain Control is the chapter title. And from there on out until, I would say, just after the question of identity. So you go from the 5th, 6th and 7th chapters. And then the conclusions are still interesting. By no means am I going to slam it. But because of the religious leaning of it, I found it a little bit like, all right. But what's the alternative for someone who doesn't believe in that gunk, essentially? That also, though, that isn't even to say that I completely dismiss religious thinking or, poo-poo it until I just don't even take anything from it, because I do. From a metaphorical viewpoint, I take a hell of a lot from religious stories, and I think that's essentially what they all are, is like they're kind of describing the human condition and the kind of trials and tribulations that you go through. And especially during certain eras of your lifetime, certain stories will have more significance. And the way Wilson compares this is convincing. I can't deny that. But at the same time, because it concentrates so much on the mystical towards the end, that I find it a little bit hard to swallow. Mainly because you can hear someone's opinion, or you can hear them talk about what they've experienced and how they came to a state of enlightenment, for instance. But for me, it's never enough. Like, that's solely dependent on somebody's memory, their interpretation of events, and the unreliability of both of those things, how they wanted to perceive it, what they wanted to see. So you can easily get lost in a kind of delusional romanticism, which I think negates from the experience as a whole. Although that isn't to say that I haven't experienced the same thing in some regards. I think a lot of the time my romantic relationship with alcohol is probably a lot to do with how it makes me feel, not necessarily whilst I'm drinking, but the day after. Probably because I'm in that stage of haven't slept enough, yet still slightly tipsy. And I found sometimes that can be when I think the best. And I believe it's kind of related to what he's talking about when you really feel at one with the essence of being, essentially. And you don't have the intellect or the critic in your mind getting in the way of how you feel about the world. And it's a kind of, it's a state of euphoria and contentment that, a little bit like what Ligotti goes on about in Conspiracy, it feels like the death of the ego, or at least I feel like that's what it feels like it's closely related to, at least. And those moments are something that I think human beings should aspire towards, or it's at least to be able to summon at will. But whether it's actually doable or not, I'm not entirely convinced by Wilson's conclusions. Although I wouldn't actually say that he would say he actually comes up with any conclusive kind of ideas towards the end of it. He's still exploring it himself, like any philosopher should. It's like you've got to constantly ask the question, constantly get into it and study it from every angle possible. So and ironically, you have to look at it from a scientific viewpoint when you're looking at stuff that is essentially unexplainable, or at least to our limited knowledge of consciousness, for instance, at this moment in history, like it has been since philosophy was born. Our ideas of what that is are still just as nebulous to us as, how expansive the universe really is. So it's one of those things that kind of, you're almost feeling like you're striving for the impossibility in a way. But what I especially did enjoy, at the risk of repeating myself, is the fact that it did remind me of what I'm trying to strive for in my own art, and especially in what I write about. And it did remind me that I do obviously lean towards these outsider type characters, because to be an outsider is like it's kind of viewing the world as not enough, essentially. Like, the day-to-day monotony of existence cannot satisfy the thirst for essentially more life, funnily enough, or at least to experience life in a way that we want to. And how we try to achieve that is kind of demonstrated through the examples that Wilson gives. I especially enjoyed what he had to say about Nietzsche, which he does include quite extensively. T.E. Lawrence is mentioned a lot, and Vincent van Gogh, and there was a ballet dancer called Nijinsky, a Russian ballet dancer. And throughout these characters, he kind of describes what their main asset is, but also what they neglected. So for Nietzsche and Lawrence, they were obviously intellectuals, so they used their intellect. That's what kind of marked them as outsiders. Van Gogh was about the way he felt. So all of his paintings, like The Starry Night, they express how he was feeling, and that's what gives them a very visceral yet abstract kind of viewpoint. So there is a mysticism to Van Gogh's art that is essentially unexplainable to human beings in a way, but it definitely provokes a certain feeling in each person and how they perceive it. And the last is Nijinsky. He would express himself via the body, and apparently from the biographies that are mentioned in this, he was a very silent man in kind of social interactions. People even thought he was a bit dumb, but when you saw him dance, you saw him transform. And Wilson's, through his own writing, he admits that he tried to do this in his first novel, and he had three characters that all essentially had those strengths, but because they neglected those other parts of their psychology or physiology, that's what essentially drove them to insanity. He does also admit that he took, or at least subconsciously took, the idea from the brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, who he also talks about quite a lot throughout the book. And also, in a funny way, you get quite a lot of the translations, or the older translations of what the books were called. So Notes from Underground is also known as Notes from Under Floorboards and stuff like that. So I might be misquoting that slightly, but it's something like Notes from the Floorboards or something like that, which is quite funny and it sounds weird, but apparently that is the literal translation from the Russian. I don't know whether anyone can confirm that for me, but I'd be interested to know. And essentially what he's saying in this instance is that if you are an outsider type in that regard, you may discover how to propel your kind of interior powers, for lack of a better phrase, or to at least put them to the best use, essentially, and exploit them for the most you can really manage. But it's unlikely you ever will, and you're more likely to go insane. Nijinsky goes insane. Nietzsche obviously went insane, although I do think that was related to syphilis more than anything else. Perhaps not, I don't know. He said Lawrence commits a kind of mind suicide at some point after he wrote the 7 Pillars of Wisdom. He kind of gave up on it all because the meaninglessness of existence is the kind of, it's the weight that no man can really bear after a while, I would say. It's always kind of there. So that's striving for more, for a more appeasing, or at least pleasing form of life is, again, ironically, kind of trampled over by the futility of existence, or at least our perceived futility of it. Wilson himself kind of comes across to me as a romanticist overall, and I think he has a positive leaning. He's an optimist overall, and that definitely comes across in his writing. Like, he's kind of striving for an answer a lot of the time and believes that there will be one. He can come across as a little bit pompous as well, I found, or at least conceited. But that's maybe my own bias because of his religious kind of leaning, or at least mystical kind of personality type. It's kind of spiritual stuff, and I have a very negative viewpoint of this way of thinking. But at the same time, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. It just doesn't quite sit well with me. It doesn't wash. He also described Camus and Sartre as being pessimistic nihilists at some point. And I just disagree with that entirely, to be honest, especially when you look at Camus's conclusions in The Myth of Sisyphus. He was all about the absurdity of existence, and he, as well as Sartre said that he wasn't an existentialist anyway. So Wilson makes a few kind of broad statements throughout it where I kind of felt myself going, is that true? Or is that just a kind of wild statement and conclusion that you've made with no real evidence to back it up? In some instances it's fine, especially I suppose when you're talking about fictional characters like Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, then you can make a few sweeping judgments against them, I suppose. But when something's said and it's quite a kind of bold, audacious sentence, then I just think sometimes it needs to be backed up by something like a quotation at least, or some kind of contextual reference where it's like a passage or some kind of excerpt would have been beneficial to see. Although that might be a little bit critical on my side, I have to admit that. Mainly because he does do it throughout. I mean, there's passages and passages and passages of different writings throughout the ages from many a different writer that he uses as examples. But then he'll do that, but then kind of make a few kind of statements where he's describing like, Merceau was like this, Raskolnikov was like this, Roquinton was like, Roquinton was like this, Steppenwolf like this. You know, it's like there's a list that he's kind of like just kind of ticking off and where they go wrong and all that kind of thing. But I think a lot of these characters could be interpreted in multiple ways, so it's a bit tricky to swallow, I would say, overall. But the book is quite phenomenal. I mean, the guy was 24 when it was released, and he'd been writing it, I believe, since he was about, I don't know, had the kind of vague idea, and he was reading stuff like Dostoevsky when he was like 13, which I find kind of amazing. He must have been of a very particular mindset to even be able to comprehend someone like Dostoevsky at that age. Makes me feel like a bit of a retard, to be honest. But at the same time, I wonder if he peaked too soon with it. And I do think that which he actually admits, I have to also really strongly recommend reading the postscripts at the end, because he's updated this particular version, which came out in '96. I think this is it's updated for a new edition. I'm not sure which one. I'm tempted to say the third, but I don't know for sure. And yeah, I find it fascinating that it was published in '56 and it was massive then. Then a version in '97 came out, and then it's been reissued by Phoenix in 2001. So it's had a number of updates throughout the years. And I think the postscripts that he's added actually add, dare I say, slightly more to what he had to say originally, because he's kind of giving it an outside perspective then, which is fascinating to read. And the ideas of reaching this peak experience, what he talks about in the postscript to chapter 1, is essentially that higher level of consciousness where you feel at one with being, in a sense. And that's where you'll feel the most potential within yourself, and there isn't that kind of criticizing kind of leaning anywhere. And overall, I would say that if you haven't read, say, I don't know, there's a list here: Kafka, Camus, Hemingway, Hess, Lawrence, Van Gogh, Shaw, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, those types, then you'll probably miss a lot of what he's talking about. You have to be kind of familiar with them at least to really get to the crux of what he's talking about. And I would say that that is something to keep in mind. People who watch this already, you know, I think I've reviewed half of these fucking books already anyway. So yeah, you'll be fine. And I think you'll appreciate it. There's one called The Inferno, or Hell, and it's by a guy called Barbusse, or Barbusse. And that sounds fucking great. It sounds like Notes from Underground, but with a kind of sexual leaning towards it. And I'm definitely going to pick that up at some point soon. And there's a number of others in there that I'm definitely going to be looking into as well. I suppose for me, I kind of wish I read it when I was a bit younger, maybe. When I first got into existentialism, that's what kind of amazed me that I hadn't even heard of it, because I was listening to like audiobooks on kind of academic and university lectures dealing with existentialism, and I do not remember this dude ever being mentioned, which I find a bit unfucking believable, to be honest, considering he's basically taken all of these writers and characters and combined them to create this idea of an outsider and of someone who does think existentially, essentially, and who wants to strive for more. So yeah, if you're looking for something that's going to give you a list of fucking good books, especially of a kind of existential and nihilistic leaning, but you also want to kind of hear someone else's opinions and conclusions of it, or of them, then this is something you should, I mean, you should definitely read it. If you're a fan of watching this, then yeah, get it, because it's a fascinating read. And what I quite liked about it is that I could disagree with some of the conclusions he came up with, because I could kind of see his own bias in a way. If he's of an optimistic leaning, and especially of a romantic kind of disposition, then he's obviously going to refute some ideas and be supportive of others. Like, he does praise Nietzsche for his life-affirming kind of philosophy, but for me, Nietzsche was a very mixed bag. He was almost like a moral nihilist for me. So there is that debate, like, oh, nihilism comes from Nietzsche, and it's like, yeah, it doesn't, but at the same time you can kind of see that it does. Same with Dostoevsky. Like, when I read his works, I don't always come to the conclusion that he was a very religious person. I actually think that he was in a complete constant state of turmoil between belief and non-belief, which many of the characters he comes up with suffered the same dilemma. So there is a kind of biographical element to his writing anyway, because I do think it is him trying to reach his own conclusions, and with certain sides of his personality, like with Alyosha in The Brothers Karamazov, he definitely does believe, and he aspires towards it, and mysticism is something very important to him. But obviously the other character of Ivan doesn't believe any of it, and he tries to crush it, essentially. And I think that's just, you know, different hemispheres of Dostoevsky's brain, essentially. But yeah, obviously it's got me thinking quite a lot. I hope this wasn't too abstract, because it feels like it might have been. But yeah, check it out. It's one of those ones that just kind of, for me, it took me about 100 pages to get into it, and then after that it really sucked me in, and I was hooked, and I pissed through another, I don't know, 150 pages or so, and then the end, I kind of wavered a little bit until he came out with the kind of postscript, where I found it again reinvigorating and just a fascinating read. And it's just something where I think you have to kind of look at it for yourself and see what kind of ideas it will provoke in you. Some of them won't be new because you've already read The Outsider by Camus, for instance, or you've read Notes from Underground. But at the same time, to get someone else's perspective of those books is fascinating in itself for me, and I believe it would be for you. So thank you very much for watching this. I'll be back again soon. Maybe I'll do another thought experiment. I've been kind of thinking of that, about doing one, but I haven't kind of decided which yet. I should probably just go on impulse and just pick something and go with that, because that's what I did last time and I think it succeeded. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Is there anything I missed about this that you would like to add? Because I'd be interested in quite a lengthy discussion of it, to be honest, and to hear your thoughts. So thank you very much for watching this. I'll see you next week. Blah de blah de blah bullshit. Adios.